Hello and welcome to my podcast. Do me a favor, subscribe to the John Keim Report wherever you get your podcasts. You're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, do me a favor. Also hit that subscribe button. You can find us there as part of Empire Media, AMPIRE. Always, always, always much appreciated. Today, I'm joined by ESPN's Dan Graziano as I wanted to bring you on a kind of a league-wide perspective on the Washington Commanders. I also did start by talking about the Philadelphia Eagles from the standpoint of what can the Commanders learn from how the Eagles have been built to reach this point. This is the third time in 20 years the Eagles have reached the Super Bowl, and it's with a different coach each time. So how have they been able to accomplish that? What can Washington learn from them? To me, if you just look at the rosters right now, got to do what the Eagles have done and get better up front. So that's going to be part of the offseason discussion. I know that's a heavy emphasis and a priority for this organization to get better along the line. Again, a big priority. So whether the Senior Bowl, Combine, whatever, the draft will, and with the free agency, whatever, they're going to look for guys to get better along the front. That's what the Eagles have done to start with for this go round of their Super Bowl run. Anyway, so I talked to Dan about that. We also talk about Washington's offensive coordinator search. Why would somebody come here in this situation? We give some answers. We talk about where they are as a franchise and what he thinks about Sam Howell and things that he's heard about Sam Howell from others around the league. So we get into all that. So stay tuned in a minute or two for that. Before we get to that point, just want to go over a couple of things, starting with the anniversary of the new name and the rebrand. A year ago, as I'm taping this, it's February 2nd. A year ago, the Commanders unveiled the new name and their new brand, and it was met with a thud, right? Well, what do you think a year later? You can leave me your thoughts on the YouTube page. There's a lot of comments underneath. You can go on there, just leave me what you think of the new name a year later. Have you accepted it? Do you like it? Are you warming to it? Do you think it doesn't matter as long as they win? So I kind of posed that question on Twitter, and basically most people either just like it or just say, just win. Doesn't matter, just win. So, but I'm curious from your perspective as a fan, as a reporter, it's still taking me a little bit of time to get used to that name. I'll be honest. I know Joe Theismann said a year ago on this date that the more you say it, the more you're going to get used to it. Well, still kind of waiting for that to happen a little bit, but this is what they're called. So this is what I call them. As a fan of a sports team that changed their name, meaning the Cleveland Indians, they went to the Cleveland Guardians. I understand what this process has been like. And I've talked about this before on the podcast, but once again, I do think there's some differences here. Part of it is the Guardians actually had a really good year and they made the playoffs, surprise team, a lot of exciting young players in the roster. So a lot of reason to look for hope to the future. It's a well-run organization. The look was also about the same as the past. The script on the front of the uniforms, the same. The color scheme, the same. The caps, you change it to a different style C, but they've changed that C over the years. So it really wasn't that big a deal. So when I would be watching them on TV, I'm not sitting there thinking, oh my God, this is a new team that this is not the team of my youth. I really kind of thought like I'm watching the same team I've watched for many, many years. A lot of the same players on there. The ballpark looked the same. The uniforms looked the same. Plus, it's a good organization, and I think that really helped the transition to a new name. I don't know how many people there have fully embraced that new name. I think what they embrace is still the organization and the team itself more so than the name, because I'm guarantee if you ask people if what they preferred, they'd go back to the old one. However, I do think they embrace this team because of everything I just said. I think that's kind of a contrast to what's happened here in Washington, that the team hasn't won in a long time, and not even a title, but just been a consistent playoff performer. They haven't done that. So I think that kind of leads to some of the lack of or the displeasure about the name or everything involved. Then there's the dislike and this distrust of the owner and the organization itself. I think it all adds to it, and they do look different. So, but anyway, that's a couple of my thoughts. I'm curious your thoughts. Leave the comments on YouTube. The second thing, as far as the offensive coordinator search, Ron Rivera did interview Anthony Lynn. Rivera has been spending the week out in California visiting his dad, also had participated in that Pro-Am at Pebble Beach. A big impetus for him going out there was to visit his dad. It's the first week he has taken off this offseason. A lot of coaches will take the time off within a few weeks of the season ending, he stayed here, did all the player evals, staff evaluations, and then also started the process of looking for a new offensive coordinator, which has consumed a lot of his time. So I think, but anyway, so that's what he's doing out there. At the Senior Bowl, you have Marty Herney, Mark Mayhew, you have Jack Del Rio, you have Ken Zampese, and a few others. They're well represented there. For those who are worried about that, they're well represented there. I know in the past from talking to Rivera, one of the things that he puts a big emphasis on leading into the draft is stuff, things that happen in the combine, but also those pro days. I remember talking to him about some receivers that he'd watched at the pro days last year and the little things that he picks up just by watching how guys are during those periods. I think that's something that he looks forward to as much as anything. Anyway, so again, interviewed Anthony Lynn, still waiting on Eric Bieniemy after the Super Bowl. Again, if I had to guess now, it would be between two guys, Bieniemy and Pat Shurmer. Just my sense, and I think a guess, maybe call it an educated guess, but I don't know for sure. But just the way, that's where I would go right now personally, just as a handicapping the situation. Could change, don't know, because I don't know everything, right? So, and you can tell me that, my kids will tell me that, but that's where I would, if I had to put my money right now on something, those would be the two. We'll see what happens, because Bieniemy would have to not only talk to them, but also he's going to, maybe depending on whether it's choices he has, would then have to pick this franchise perhaps over somebody else like a Baltimore. Still ways to go. Anyway, just wanted to give you an update on that. So stay tuned now. Here's my conversation with ESPN's Dan Graziano. Well, Dan, I appreciate you joining me. And I want to start with, because we have the Super Bowl coming up, the Eagles, the NFC East, and how Washington kind of stacks up in there. But let's start with the Eagles, because when you look at them, like, this is 3 Super Bowl trips now in 20 years with different coaches each time. What have they figured out that this team and others maybe have not?
I mean, like, this all kind of started in a game against Washington at the end of the 2020 season, right? Where they pulled the Hurts, right? And they put in, what was it, Sudfeld? And everybody went nuts, and like the Giants fans got nuts, and Joe Judge was yelling about the Eagles throwing the game and all this kind of stuff. And Doug Peterson gets fired, and Carson Wentz gets traded to Indianapolis. And like all of a sudden, like, they hire Nick Sirianni and they decide they're going to work with Hurts. So that was kind of like where it all kind of turned, right, to the current iteration. But, a lot has to, like, the way they operate, the way they run their team. One of their guiding principles is we're never going to get caught short at the quarterback position, right? Like, they draft Jalen Hurts in the 2nd round right after they signed Carson Wentz to an extension. Like, they were never expected in their ideal world, Hurts never plays for them, right? Because Wentz is great and is their franchise guy and takes them to multiple Super Bowls. But obviously it didn't happen, and you can't count on your ideal world. So they thought, well, here's a guy we think can be a starting quarterback in the NFL, and we can get him in the 2nd round. Let's do it. And all of a sudden you have this, he turns out to be this incredibly driven, self-motivated, hyper-talented, leader who could be on the verge of superstardom in the league. They didn't know that, but it was worth a shot, right? So they're constantly building out the roster in those ways. Like, you look at some of the draft picks in recent years and what the reasons for it are. Jordan Davis is a great player for them already, but one of the reasons they have him is because they look down the road and they think maybe we're only going to have Fletcher Cox another year or two, and they draft a couple interior linemen because, well, Jason Kelsey, we don't know how long he's going to want to play, but we know how old he is, and we may need, so they're constantly operating that way. Last year, they had 3 first-round picks. They feel like, we're not going to do the quarterback thing. Let's spin one of those off and get another for next year in case. Now they're sitting here with 2 first-round picks this year. Like, it's almost like 3D chess. Like you're always seeing the different possibilities of what could happen. As fans, I think very often people think, the draft is like, well, they need this position. The Eagles are thinking, we need all the positions all the time.
Right.
And I think that's why you have a situation where twice in 5 years with 2 different coaches, 2 different quarterbacks, you could end up in the Super Bowl. And frankly, I think they're probably favored to win it, right? I mean,
I would think so.
We have to see who's healthy for the Chiefs here in the next week and a half.
Yeah. And when you look at them, you bring up the point about the quarterbacks too. How many teams do you think really, because it's, you talk to guys like, older guys, the Ron Wolfs of the world, who, like, you never believed you had enough of them. And, I remember even couple of years ago when it was a Chase Young pick here, you'd have Mel Kiper. Like, if you don't have a quarterback, you've got to take one, period. So how many people do you think really kind of adhere to that philosophy for teams?
It's got to be one you believe in, though, right? I mean,
Sure,
they saw something in Jalen Hurts. They could force a pick, and then, they didn't take one in the first round that year. There was an opportunity that presented itself. So, but I mean, look at them now. Like, Gardner Minshew is the backup. Like, that's a real quarterback who has started games in the league. Like, you can put him in and feel like if you have the rest of your rosters in good shape, you can be okay. Go back to when Wentz started. They had Sam Bradford, right? And they had Wentz and they had Chase Daniel. That was their quarterback depth chart. And Teddy Bridgewater gets hurt. So Minnesota sends him a 1 for Bradford. And they're like, well, Wentz is ready. We can do this. And 2 years later in their Super Bowl, in large part because of what Wentz did. So, yeah, it's just constantly like the number 2 quarterback is not the 53rd guy on the roster, right? like that's a more relevant position than that. And I think that they definitely view that way as something worth investing in and worth cultivating. And as a result, I mean, they've had this level of success. Again, the last time they're in the Super Bowl, Nick Foles was the starter, right? I mean, so this is a team that has lived that credo and done it the right way. And again, it's not just get a quarterback, it's make sure it's somebody you can believe in and or count on.
It also seems like count on, but also build around them. And I think that's one of the things that impresses me. They built that line. They added, Jalen Hurts needs more weapons, give him more weapons. And so I think that's one of the things they seem to have identified and aggressively attacked what they needed, it seems.
Right. And the specificity of it strikes me too, because like A.J. Brown, obviously a lot has to happen for a guy like that to become available and then to get him. But when they looked last year, so we need another receiver. Because I mean, Devontae Smith, first round pick and an incredible player.
Right.
He could be your number 1, right? And that's okay. But they felt like A.J. Brown is a guy that excels at doing things route wise in the middle of the field that on throws that Jalen Hurts has kind of struggled with. So not only is he a dynamic player and a potential number 1 receiver, but he also helps us in a very specific way that pertains to our quarterback and what he specifically needs. So it was a perfect addition. And he hadn't been available. Maybe they do take a shot on like a Tyreek Hill, whatever. Sure. But they identified Brown early on as a guy that A, could be available for reasons that he ended up being, and B, someone who could help them in a specific way, as in addition to just being a really great player on a team with other great players. So yeah, they're a great example of how to do it. And so are the Chiefs. I mean, the Chiefs are, I mean, I was at their game on Sunday and wrote about this, like the number of contributions they're getting from their rookie class, right? like the Chiefs, we think of as sort of this mainstay, but they're almost like, I almost look at them as like they're kind of earlier in their window maybe than the Eagles are when you think about the youth of their roster, which is amazing to think about. So yeah, there's a study in that too, in terms of roster building. And of course, when you have Mahomes, everything's easier.
And when you look at the NFC East too, like, I mean, it does feel like the Eagles and everybody else. How do you see it that? I know, first of all, we also know that there's the last repeat winner is what, 2004. Yeah. You never know what looks like one thing now, a year from now, we could be looking at it differently because they do have Matt Bowen came out with his top 50 free agents. 6 of them in the top 42 are from Philadelphia. So, there's always that, ability to keep it together.
Sure.
But how do you handicap the other 3 teams in going into this offseason who are already done is, how would you handicap the rest?
I mean, Dallas is a 12-win team that is probably another receiver or 2 away from, sort of maintaining its level of performance. The Giants are a playoff team. They'll bolster the offense around Jones and ideally Saquon Barkley if they keep those 2 guys. But you're right. I mean, I believe in that. That division is so tightly bunched all the time. That 18-year streak is no joke. So yeah, I don't think you assume that the Eagles roll to another title next year. And I think, what the Commanders do at quarterback could make a big difference in all this as well, because they're, you obviously know that the receivers look really good. The defense has been good. Like there's stuff there, right? That's not a nothing team. That's not
they weren't far behind
ground zero rebuild. Right. Exactly. So I don't know what they're going to do at quarterback, but there are a lot of interesting options. And if they get it right, then they have a chance to be in that mix in a division that, as you say, is the only thing I feel like we know is that the Eagles aren't going to win it.
That's right. So when you look at, because like obviously right now, Sam Howell is a guy that they really, they're liking, they're intrigued by. And, you know, whether or not he ends up to be the starter, he's going to go in there as the guy that has the best shot to win it right now. We don't know what other moves they're going to make. My guess is they're going to get a mid-level vet, you know, whether it's re-signing Heineke, get a guy like Brissett, someone of that level. What do you think the perception, you know, have you talked to anybody about Howell and gotten any sort of sense of what other teams maybe think about Howell, whether from before the draft or now?
There were one or two people that told me before the draft that, you know, so much was flying around about the quarterbacks, and I like that guy could be the best one in the draft. And I heard that from more than one place, and not from Washington. So yeah, I think that's, you know, he performed at a high level early in his college career. His last year was not his best. So there's stuff there. I mean, like Hurts is a good example, right? Like these guys are not always going to be what they are when they enter the league. Right. Like if you get the right people around him and the right coaching around him, and he's the right kind of person, then you can work on the stuff. Now, it may be that Sam Howell has limitations that keep him from ever being Joe Burrow or Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen, but that doesn't mean that he can't be extremely good. Right. And again, that they do have a lot of places for him to throw the ball. I mean, like they've done a really good job building that out. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, to me, it's like, I would think you have to, if you're in their position, you have to think about, well, if we aim really high, what's it look like? And then let's say, like, can we get Aaron Rodgers? I'm just throwing this as a completely.
Well, they tried last year.
Yeah. And if you can't, then all right, well, where does that leave us? Right. What we would have spent in terms of resources to acquire Aaron Rodgers, whether that's picks, money, both. How do we allocate that? If the quarterback option is a mid-range, like a Jacoby Brissett, well, that leaves us an awful lot that we were going to spend on Aaron Rodgers that we don't have to spend for Jacoby. So what do we do with that to make sure Jacoby's in the best position or Sam Howell's in the best position? So that's where they have to sort of operate, and they have to assess what they have in Howell and what they can reasonably expect him to be next year and going forward if they're going to make that kind of decision.
Right. And I think fixing the offensive line and going back to the Eagles, the thing I really, really like about what they've done is that offensive line. And Dallas, of course, was powered by that line for years. And then, you know, had built around that. But I think that's one of the areas they're going to attack to do exactly what you said. And something that they said they wanted to do with Carson Wentz, it did not work. Were you surprised at how bad it went with Wentz?
No. You mean this year in Washington?
Yeah.
No, because I mean, like, it didn't, he went to Indy and it was supposed to work with Frank Reich and they were close and all this kind of stuff. And it just didn't work. And I remember being in Indy's camp this summer, sort of asking around about why it didn't work. And you heard a lot about how, you know, Wentz he's a good player. He's not a bad guy. He's just kind of, you know, he's a little stubborn. And like, we were trying to get him to do certain things. And he was sure that he could do what he wanted to do instead. Like, it just didn't seem like he was taking coaching very well in Indianapolis. And I thought, well, Reich was supposed to be the Wentz whisperer, right? Like, if he can't take that guy's coaching, right, then how's he going to go somewhere else? So I'm not surprised that it didn't go well. You saw flashes, like you see what he can do, but he doesn't do it consistently, and he doesn't seem to be the kind of guy that, you know, is willing to look in the mirror and say, here's what I really need to grind on in order to fix this problem. And if he's not going to be that, then he's not going to last.
Right. Here's the other thing. Do you think his career, I mean, where do you think the future is for him? Because, you know, it's funny because someone was like, well,
Carolina.
You could maybe, but like, if somebody gets hurt during the season, if he's not signed, do they go get him? But like, if he's a guy who holds the ball, you want guys who can come in and move a little bit in that kind of situation. So like, what is his future, do you think?
I think his best case scenario is he's Geno Smith, right? Like, you go somewhere where you can work on your craft and not have to perform on Sunday, right? And you get with a coach that can identify the parts of your game that need work and how to attack. And then when your opportunity comes again, you're better positioned than anyone expected you to be. Right. I think that's ideal, right? Like that's a good, now I'm not saying it has to take that long. But I mean, there are very few of those situations. Were there 60 different starting quarterbacks in the league this year? I mean, like, wherever he ends up, if he's end up as a backup, there's a chance he's going to have to play.
Right.
Geno played behind Russell Wilson, who never got hurt. So I think Wentz has to find a way to operate in the shadows for a while and really drill down on the parts of his game that need to improve if he's going to be a successful NFL player. Because if he gets thrown into a situation again where he's just out there on Sunday winging it around and he hasn't had to confront his deficiencies, then I don't think he's ever going to have a chance to correct that. And I'm not saying he's going to get it done if he's in a Geno situation. Right. Again, not everybody does that.
Right.
But I think that's the ideal path if he's going to have anything like the career that he anticipated.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm curious, like, what team would actually want to take that chance with him, knowing that he doesn't have the mobility and he has, like, you know, there's a penchant for holding the ball. You better have a really good line if you're going to get him. So there's so many things that I just wonder how he would view his future as well. What about, like, for Washington? The big question here is Duron Payne and signing him. What do you think the market will be for Duron Payne?
Yeah, I think we've seen the guys that are excellent at that position, you know, can get paid, you know, pretty well. I mean, I think that's, and I think he's a guy that, I mean, you see him, you see all his games. Like he's a really good player. Like he's not going to be easy for them to sign because I assume there's going to be other interest. The defensive tackle position doesn't get the glory that the edge rusher gets, obviously, and it doesn't get the money the edge rusher gets. But some of those guys have done really well for themselves, and I think, you know, you're in a situation where, I don't know, is he like a Dexter Lawrence type and what he's doing in New York? Like, is he like, I'm trying to think what his market is going to be, who his comps are. But
it's hard because he's coming off a career year and 11 and a half sacks. Like, he didn't show anything to that level before this year. And so I just, you know, and you talk to other people, it's like, no, they think he still can maybe not duplicate 11 and a half, but still be an effective pass rusher. But it's still, you wonder how that plays out on the market. Like, you know, I mean,
it might be one of those guys that they value him more highly than other teams would, right? Because they know him and right.
And how much do you invest in the defensive line if you're Washington? You just paid John Allen. You have Montez Sweat coming up the following year. You know,
Chase Young at some point, maybe if he can consistently be on the field. He just had kind of a lost year. Yeah, but yes, I mean, look, the defensive line is not a bad place to invest. Like you mentioned, they have to invest on the offensive line, and at some point they have to get a quarterback. So my sense would be you probably don't want to overcommit. Like, I think you have to find a deal with Duron Payne that where you go to him and say, look, here's what we have to do. Like, we've got to spend money elsewhere. Like, if you can get more than this and that's what you want, fine. But if you'll work with us on structure, right? If you'll work with us on guarantee structure, you know, we can work something out. So I don't think it's necessarily like if there's a bidding war for him, you're right. They're probably not positioned to win it as much as a team that looks at it as, hey, that's our one big need. Right. Like let's look at teams that kind of almost made it this year that could use that, you know, Dallas, right. For example. So you could get outbid for a team like that's all they have to use their resources on. But yeah, I think it's probably a tricky sign for them.
How much do you think the ownership situation will kind of muddle free agency for these guys? Like, do you think that, you know, how much will, like, I know it could depend on their budget and all that and who pays, but also how will agents react to guys coming here when you look at the, you know, not just ownership, but then Rivera's going to his fourth year, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think with regard to, like, if you're hiring an offensive coordinator, right, you may have candidates that look and say, well, are they going to sell the team? I don't know if Rivera's going to be there more than one more, you know, like that could, but I think with players, I think you don't see that as much, right? I think if you can offer the money and you can, you know, maybe if you're bringing in a quarterback and there's somebody they want to work, but they're very, you know, their careers are short. They don't get to really be that choosy. So I don't know that it affects free agency unless, you know, Snyder knows he's going to sell and he wants to cut back on spending. I mean, that's the kind of thing, right? But I think if the money's going to be there, I don't think ownership change is going to affect really much of in terms of potential, you know, players wanting to sign there. I think that's probably a couple levels removed from the way most free agents think.
Right. And you know, it's funny because I've had people ask me before about when when Scott McCloughan was here and their GM questions like, oh, nobody's going to want to sign there now. Players typically are going to sign where they're going to pay them.
Right.
I mean,
if they had fired Rivera and they were looking for a head coach, then ownership questions would be a factor, right? Like a head coach might not want to come here knowing the team's going to get sold, and now I work for somebody that didn't hire me. But they didn't, and maybe that's one of the reasons why Rivera was safe. I don't know. In addition to, maybe he's find a good enough job, but I think when it comes to players, I think you're right. I don't think that plays much into it.
What about, and you brought up the coordinator, because they do need an offensive coordinator.
They do.
So how would you assess, there's still a few of them open. How would you assess this opening compared to like a Baltimore, Tennessee, which is still have those jobs open?
Yeah, look, it's a seller's market, right? When you factor in the 5 head coach openings, there were at one point 13 potential offensive coordinator openings.
Right.
So if you are worried about, well, who's the quarterback going to be and how long is the coach going to be there, you can pass on an opportunity like that, knowing you might have others. But they're filling up, right. So that, like the Jets hired, the Chargers hired, the Rams. So look, I think someone like Bieniemy is interesting, right? Because here's a guy that doesn't seem to be able to get his head coach opportunity. Maybe he's on Indy's list still. I don't know. But I think he's going to want to go somewhere where no one can say, oh, it's really Andy Reid.
Right.
Right. And I understand all the argument. I get what's at play there, and I'm sympathetic, right? Like that didn't keep Matt Nagy and Doug Peterson from getting jobs. And I recognize the unfairness of it. But the world's an unfair place. And I think at this point, Eric Bieniemy realizes that. So this may be an opportunity to come in and say, I can put my stamp on something. And if you have a talented guy who's driven to do that, then you might fall into something. But I also think it's tough to hire an offensive coordinator when you can't tell them who the quarterback's going to be, right? So like that's the other thing they have to figure out. So I don't think I don't think when you look back when there were all those openings that they would have been the top one. And I think the reason is the uncertainty around the quarterback situation and the uncertainty around the coaching situation, if in fact, and we don't know, maybe Ron Rivera coaches there 10 more years. I have no idea, but the fact of the matter is, if they don't win next year, there are going to be legitimate questions about his future there.
Right.
So I think you have to find someone who's got a little something to prove, who's on the come, and hope that you find yourself a star. And unfortunately, if you do, you might not have him for long.
Right.
But you might set some good foundations in the meantime.
Well, and that's why with Bieniemy, because you're right. Like because people ask, why would he leave KC? Well, because he'd want to call his own plays. And you want to show that it's, I can do this versus I'm just part of Andy Reid's system. And, but then it's like, well, would you, if he's offered it here, because they're going to wait for him. If he's offered it here, what if Baltimore offers it too? You have Lamar, you have a stable situation. Why would you pick Washington in that situation? Are those receivers enough to say, and then I guess it depends if you like Sam Howell.
And Lamar, Lamar is not, there are coaches who, right or wrong, look at Lamar and go, I'm not sure, right? Like, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to design what I need to design to maximize him.
Right. And
Lamar is great, obviously, like that's a good problem to have, but it's also, some of these guys don't feel creative enough, right? Right. Or want to work that hard to build that. So Greg Roman did, and to great effect for a while. And the other thing is, Lamar is a free agent who does not have a long-term. You don't know. Maybe it goes bad in negotiations and he demands a trade. Now you show up. Now you don't have Lamar, and now you're in a situation very similar to what you've got in Washington, maybe even worse. So I think it becomes about where you want to live, where you see your best opportunity, where you think if you're let's say use the Bieniemy example again. He wants to be a head coach. Does this help me? Does this help propel me toward that? Would I do better working with this group here? Maybe you say, the receivers, like whoever the quarterback is, you can have better receivers than Baltimore does. We like the running backs. Maybe we like what they're doing on the offensive line. So yeah, I think there are possible ways that you could convince yourself to pick that over. And I don't know. This would be a bad reason to do it, but looking from the outside, John Harbaugh is not going anywhere anytime soon. But if you think Ron Rivera might be,
well, and that's what you never know.
Take over, right?
Well, because if the offense does well and the team doesn't win overall, then maybe you're in a position to get that. And he's got a reputation as a guy who pushes people pretty hard. So we'll see. What about like Pat Shurmur is another name in there? He's been around a while. Do you have a sense for his reputation as an offensive coach?
Yeah, I think you know exactly what you're going to get there. I mean, he's got plenty in the bank. You've seen the good. You've seen him win with Case Keenum and put up points, and you've seen places where it hasn't gone as well for him. Yeah, I mean, look, I think he's pretty reliable. Like, he knows how to run the room. He knows how to operate a practice. He knows how to design a system. You know, whether he's had some success with it, he's had some places where he didn't. So you have to decide whether the recent failures of his were because whatever, Denver never had a quarterback, right? The Giants situation was a mess, or because maybe he's lost his fastball. So he's been around a while, and again, I think you know exactly what you're going to get there. So that's sort of the other way to go. If you want to bring in the up and comer and hope you catch a rising star, versus, well, we want stability, we want something reliable, we want something we know exactly what it's going to be every day, then Shurmer fits that category.
Just a couple of minutes here. Staying with quarterbacks, because one of the guy I wanted to ask you about was Justin Fields, because this team was very interested in him coming out a couple of years ago and wanted to move up for him, didn't want to pay whatever the price it was. Is Chicago going to keep him?
I think that's the most likely outcome. Yes. I know it's been raised, the possibility, since they have the one pick of like, if you think Bryce Young is better, then it makes sense to amass those picks and do it. I don't think that's how they're thinking. It may be that they get through their evaluations and decide, yes, Bryce Young or CJ Stroud or Will Levis or whoever is a better long-term play, especially considering what we could get for Fields. But I also think it's possible they look into what they can get for the pick. And that may be even more, right? When you think about if somebody wants to come up and take one of those guys. The quarterbacks in this year's draft, I mean, you're hearing a lot of stuff. I mean, Bryce Young, everybody loves the way Bryce Young plays, but they all wish he was taller, right? And so, like,
he's under 200 pounds too.
Yes. So there's questions about that. And there's questions about, you know, upside on CJ Stroud, and there's questions about polish on Will Levis and obviously Richardson. So it may be that it's not the year to go up and get a quarterback at one, in which case the Bears could very well stand pat and take Jalen Carter or Will Anderson and be very happy with that, because that would be a significant helper for them in the short and long term. So I don't know if they've decided yet, but I think that the likely outcome is that they keep him, yes.
And where do you think, what about Carr? Where do you think he ends up? And again, I would just say this, I do not believe this team's going to go for him. So, you know, but I mean, until he's somewhere.
You don't think they'll pursue him at all, or you don't think
they did? Well, let me say this. They called on him a couple times last year. I would be really surprised if they were aggressive going after him. Now, if he's free,
right,
I think you owe it to yourself to call. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they're going to trade for him.
I don't. Maybe I'm kidding myself. I don't know how anyone's going to trade for him, because he has a no trade clause, and why would he help out the Raiders? Like, no, you know, like cut me or pay me. Like I can go be a free agent and make more. Or if you want to wait till 3 days after the Super Bowl, then I got $40 million guaranteed coming the next 2 years, no matter what you do. So I would play hardball with them if I were him, but he hasn't in the past. Maybe now that he's been fired, he will. But anyway, if they cut him, he's a street free agent. They could sign him in February if they wanted to. So I'm interested to see that. I like that spot for him, you know, because I think he's obviously shown more than Sam Howell has. He's shown more than Jacoby Brissett has, you know, guys we've talked about earlier. And I think he's, you know, he's never really played with a very good defense. And they have receivers. They have a running back or two that they like. Yeah, I like that spot for him. I think that's the kind of team he needs to be looking at. And I'm not sure how they feel about him, but yeah, I think he could do well there.
2 more minutes. Jones and Barkley, they're going to go back to New York, you think?
Tricky, because there's only one franchise tag.
Right.
So I think they'd love to re-sign Daniel Jones and tag Barkley for $10 million, which would be like a pay cut for Saquon. But I think if they can't reach a deal with Jones, that he gets tagged and then Barkley ends up on the market. Now, it's a flooded running back free agent market, and that's a position nobody likes to pay anyway. So maybe they end up being able to keep him even if that happens. But I think they'd like to keep them both. The quarterback, as is often the case, is the priority.
And last thing on Bieniemy, what is his reputation with people you talk to about him as an offensive coach? And why do people think do they think he'd be a good play caller and coordinator in a full-time situation without Andy Reid around?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think Reid is in charge of everything there,
Right.
and fundamentally is the play caller. But Bieniemy has play calling experience. Reid does he does farm some of that out, and more as the years have gone on. So he's done it. He's got leadership qualities, right? Like he's good in the room, and players respect him and listen to him. I think, I don't know half the league has interviewed him for head coach and no one's hired him. So I don't know. There's some disconnect when he gets in that room. But my understanding is that he's a good coach and certainly at least as deserving of an opportunity as some others before him have been, if not more so.
Right.
So I think you'd get someone who's incredibly motivated and well-trained, right? Like he's worked for the right people and overdue for an opportunity. So that can all be good things.
There you go. Graz, appreciate your time. You're the best. Thanks a lot, man.
My pleasure.
That's it for this episode. Thanks to Dan for joining me, and thank you, as always, for listening. I'll be back on Sunday night / 3, 2, 1. That's it for this episode. Thanks to Dan for joining me, and thank you, as always, for listening. I'll be back with a new podcast out Sunday night. It'll be on YouTube Monday morning with the voice of the Commanders, Bram Weinstein, as we go over a lot of the roster decisions, starting with what do you do with Duron Payne? Should you consider trading him? We get into all of that. Again, Sunday night, podcast, Monday morning, YouTube. Talk to you next time.